Henry Rollins wore out his Grateful Dead tapes. Not once, multiple times. The guy who became the face of hardcore punk, screaming into microphones at Black Flag shows, was listening to 45 minutes of Dark Star until the cassettes literally stopped working. And he wasn't alone. Greg Ginn, the founder of Black Flag, said his all-time favorite band was the Grateful Dead. He told Rolling Stone in 1985 that he dreamed of Black Flag opening for them. Dead t-shirts were reportedly common among Black Flag's roadies. So what happened? How did the band that supposedly represented everything punk hated, long jams, noodling solos, tie-dyed crowds, end up influencing some of hardcore's most important figures? The answer goes back further than most people realize, and it starts with spiked beer in an Atlanta park. July 7th, 1969, Piedmont Park in Atlanta. The Grateful Dead had just finished playing the Atlanta International Pop Festival. But instead of leaving town, they decided to throw a free concert in the park. No tickets, no security, just music. Their payment? Travel expenses, hotel rooms, and 2 cases of beer. Took one look at those 2 cases and saw an opportunity. He cracked open every bottle. He calmly dosed each one with premium Owsley acid, the same LSD that was fueling the entire San Francisco scene. According to people who were there, everyone around the pavilion started glowing within an hour. This wasn't a mistake. This was deliberate. The Dead weren't just playing music for free. They were creating an experience, building a community of misfits who didn't fit anywhere else. And that community would eventually include punks. Atlanta in the late 60s had something that most cities didn't. Piedmont Park had evolved from occasional holiday concerts into near daily gatherings. Local bands like the Hampton Grease Band and Radar played alongside national acts who would just show up. The Hampton Grease Band deserves a mention here. They were Atlanta's own freaks, experimental, loud, impossible to categorize. They represented the same outsider energy the Dead brought from San Francisco. It was chaotic. It was free. It was built entirely outside the music industry. Robin Conant, who was there, remembers it simply. Local heroes such as Radar or the unbelievable Hampton Grease Band would play. National acts showed up too. The Dead loved it. They came back multiple times, always for minimal payment, always treating it like a community gathering instead of a business transaction. This wasn't charity. This was philosophy. The idea that music should be accessible, that community mattered more than profit, that the freaks and misfits deserved their own place. And that philosophy would spread. By 1976, Athens, Georgia, just over an hour east, would birth the B-52s, a new wave band that came directly from the same misfit tradition. Different sound, same spirit. This is important because it established something. A DIY ethic that had nothing to do with record labels or radio play. You didn't need permission. You didn't need a venue. You just needed people who wanted to be there. Sound familiar? That's the same philosophy that would drive punk 10 years later. The same spirit that made kids start bands in their garages and book shows in VFW halls. The same rejection of corporate rock and stadium excess. By 1977, the Sex Pistols were touring America. Their first show? Atlanta. The city that hosted those free Piedmont Park concerts was now watching punk arrive on stage. Different decade, different sound, but the underlying current was the same. Music for people who didn't fit anywhere else. But in 1969, punk didn't exist. The Dead were already doing it. They were the house band for a revolution that didn't have a name yet. Fast forward to March 10th, 1978. Jerry Garcia and John Kahn were doing a radio interview on WCMF in Rochester. The interviewer asked Garcia about punk and new wave, the movements that are supposedly destroying everything the 60s stood for. Garcia doesn't take the bait. Instead, he says something unexpected. The Who were the original punks. Not the Sex Pistols, not the Ramones, the Who. This wasn't random. Garcia had watched the Who since the 60s. He's seen their aggression, their willingness to destroy their instruments on stage, their rejection of the safe, polished rock that dominated radio. Pete Townsend smashing his guitar wasn't theater. It was rage. Keith Moon-destroyed drum kits wasn't a gimmick. It was chaos. Roger Daltrey screaming himself hoarse wasn't performance. It was conviction. That's what Garcia recognized. The Who had the spirit before punk had the name. He goes on to explain that he respects the energy in new wave musicians, even when their technical skills aren't there yet. They may not be very good, Garcia admits, but the spirit is something young people always have. Garcia admired the Who's music and respected their drive. He understood why they eventually grew tired of playing the same show night after night. That's what corporate rock demanded. Consistency, predictability, the same product every time. The Dead rejected that entirely. Every show was different. Every jam went somewhere new. That's what Garcia valued in punk, the willingness to prioritize energy and spirit over technical perfection. This wasn't a defensive musician protecting his territory. Garcia genuinely saw connections between what the Dead were doing and what punk was trying to do. Both were reactions against corporate rock. Both valued authenticity over polish. Both built communities that operated outside mainstream culture. Music historian Jesse Jarnow would later put it more directly. Punks and Deadheads both created utopian communities that existed outside mainstream American culture. They were different reactions to the same problem. A music industry that had become bloated, safe, and boring. 1 month later, the Dead played 2 shows at the Fox Theater in Atlanta. April 10th and 11th, 1978. The first night was mellow, an unusual Franklin's Tower flowing into Black Peter. Solid, but not exceptional. Reviewers would later describe it as just okay. But the second night was different. These shows are interesting for a few reasons. First, they marked a transition point in the Dead sound. The jams were getting longer, more exploratory. The April 11th show featured a 23-minute Scarlet Begonias that melted into Fire on the Mountain, which then led into a massive drum segment. Second, Betty Cantor-Jackson was recording them. Her soundboard recordings, known as Betty boards, were pristine. They captured every note, every improvised moment, and those recordings would get traded on cassettes, passed from fan to fan, copied and recopied until the tapes wore out. This is crucial. The Dead understood that trading tapes wasn't piracy. It was community building. Deadheads would mail cassettes across the country. They'd meet in parking lots to trade. They'd spend hours making copies for friends. The music spread organically, outside any official distribution channel. Just like punk's cassette culture would do a few years later, demos recorded in basements, copied onto Maxell tapes, passed hand to hand, no record stores, no radio play, just people sharing music they believed in. The April 11th show, according to reviewers, had a rock-solid first set. Samson and Delilah hit hard. The Scarlet Begonias jam showcased the band's improvisational DNA. And the drum segment was, in one reviewer's words, a monster. But here's what matters. The Dead weren't playing tight 3-minute songs. They were exploring, taking risks, improvising in real time. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. Garcia made mistakes and the crowd would cheer anyway. Henry Rollins later described going to Dead shows and hearing Garcia mess up. The crowd's reaction? Yeah, nice one, fat boy. Rollins loved it. He called it a very friendly environment. That acceptance of imperfection, that willingness to let music go wherever it needed to go, that was the opposite of corporate rock's polished perfection. And punks understood it. But they also understood why most punks initially rejected the Dead. If you're used to 2-minute songs, Ramones playing Blitzkrieg Bop in under 2 minutes, Dead Kennedys packing Maximum Fury into 90 seconds, a 20-minute jam is going to seem insane. Self-indulgent. Everything punk was trying to destroy. Garcia acknowledged this tension. He knew that Dead jams required listeners to be keyed in, to commit to the journey. Punk songs didn't ask for commitment. They hit you immediately and were over before you could think about it. 2 different approaches, same core belief. Reject the mainstream, trust your community, keep it real. Ginn started playing guitar after seeing groups like the Grateful Dead perform. That's not speculation. That's what Ginn told Stay Thirsty Media in 2010. He explained that improvisation had always been central to how he approached music. not as some 60s throwback, but as a fundamental creative principle. And in 1985, Black Flag released an almost entirely instrumental album called The Process of Weeding Out. It was largely improvised. This confused a lot of Black Flag fans. They wanted short, fast, angry songs. Instead, they got these sprawling experimental pieces that went wherever Ginn's guitar took them. Some fans hated it, but the ones who got it understood what Ginn was doing. He was applying the Dead's improvisational ethos to hardcore's intensity. The connection isn't that Black Flag sounded like the Grateful Dead. They didn't. Black Flag was aggressive, short, fast. The Dead were exploratory, long, and meandering. But the philosophy was the same. Both bands valued the moment of creation over the polished final product. Both were willing to let mistakes happen. Both built their followings through grassroots distribution. Cassettes for punks, tapes for Deadheads. And both were building something bigger than just music. Rollins bought Oxo Moxoa, Anthem of the Sun, and Working Man's Dead. 3 very different Dead albums. One psychedelic, one experimental, one back to basics. He wore out those tapes listening to them. Not as background music, he was actively engaging with what the Dead were doing, trying to understand their approach to improvisation and community. In 1999, he and Andrew Weiss recorded a cover of Franklin's Tower under the name Wartime. They stripped it down to bass and voice, gave it a go-go beat, stretched it to 8 minutes. It wasn't a punk version. It wasn't a parody. It was a genuine reinterpretation that honored the original while making it their own. Watch by night, watch by day. When asked about it later, Rollins was direct. It came from genuine admiration for the Dead. This is where the story gets interesting. Because Rollins wasn't some outlier, Dead t-shirts were common among Black Flag's roadies. Multiple hardcore musicians admitted, sometimes quietly, sometimes openly, that they respected what the Dead were doing. Why quietly? Because in 1978, admitting you'd like the Grateful Dead could get you laughed out of a punk club. The cultural divide was supposed to be absolute. Hippies were the past, punks were the future. The two couldn't coexist. Except they did. In 1978, Rollins was at a recording studio mastering his album Lifetime. The Grateful Dead were in another room remastering their back catalog. Someone invited Rollins to listen. He went. He didn't make a big deal about it. He didn't announce it. But he spent time listening to those remastered tracks because he was genuinely interested in what the Dead had accomplished. That same year, Greg Ginn was still telling people that the Dead were his favorite band. Not as a joke, not as irony, as a sincere statement of musical admiration. So what's the real story here? The real story is that the line between hippies and punks was never as solid as people thought. Both movements were built by misfits who didn't fit into mainstream culture. Both valued community over commerce. Both used DIY distribution to bypass the music industry. Both were willing to fail in public. The difference was aesthetic. Punks wore leather and safety pins. Deadheads wore tie-dye and sandals. Punk songs were 2 minutes. Dead jams were 20 minutes. But strip away the surface and you find the same core. A rejection of corporate rock, a commitment to authenticity, and a belief that music should create community. Jesse Jarnow, who's written extensively about the Dead, argues that both punks and Deadheads were building utopian spaces outside mainstream America. They weren't just making music, they were creating alternative ways of living. The Dead did it with free concerts in parks and tape trading networks. Punks did it with all-ages shows in basements and photocopied zines. Different methods, same goal. Create space for people who didn't have space anywhere else. And that started in places like Piedmont Park, where it continued through the 1970s, when Betty Cantor-Jackson soundboard recordings spread through the tape trading networks. And it carried into the 80s when hardcore kids like Rollins and Ginn quietly admitted they loved the band everyone else said they should hate. The Grateful Dead weren't punk. They were doing what punk would later do, building community from the ground up, rejecting the mainstream, and trusting their community to spread the word. Some music lovers argue that without the Grateful Dead doing their thing in the mid to late 60s, Punk rock might have never been invented. That might be overstating it. But it's not wrong to say that the Dead and punk were branches of the same tree. Different sounds, different styles, same roots. Both understood that the best music happens when you stop trying to please everyone and start building something real for the people who actually care. Corporate rock wanted perfection. The Dead and punks wanted truth. Corporate rock wanted predictability. The Dead and punks wanted discovery. The corporate rock wanted audiences. The Dead and punks wanted communities. And when Henry Rollins wore out his Dark Star cassettes, he understood that. He knew that he was listening to the same misfit spirit, just playing at a different tempo. The same rejection of the mainstream. The same commitment to creating spaces where freaks could gather without judgment. Black Flag's basement shows in 1981 were separated by 12 years and completely different aesthetics. But they were expressions of the same idea. Music belongs to the people who need it, not the people who sell it. The revolution doesn't care what you're wearing or how long your songs are. It just cares if you show up.